They're coming down. Will you let them?
You want me to lower them?
Whoever wants to let them, we're just on the way down.
Going to go in your pocket on this side.
What if I just put it back on the
Okay.
bill? Is that all right?
Yep.
Hello.
Are we live?
This is very high. I feel like I could sort of fly.
if it'll ring up there. Is that okay? Sorry about that. Thank you.
So thanks for coming, y'all. Welcome. For those of you who don't know, I'm Steve Coll, and I'm the dean here, and this is our guest who we're really delighted to welcome and very privileged to have this public conversation with him. Austin Beutner is probably best known to those of you in the journalism profession for the turn he took running the Los Angeles Times over the last couple of years. Really a forceful and forward-looking publisher at a time when local newspapers were looking for leadership and models to figure out how to keep strong local journalism alive in the digital age. And I think that's what we're going to focus most of our conversation around now, which is the future of newspapers and what he learned from plunging in. And we'll talk for maybe 20, 25 minutes, depending on how it goes, and then we'll open it up to you. Those of you who follow coverage about the media will know that Austin and the Tribune Company, which owns the Los Angeles Times, parted company abruptly last month, and so there are some aspects of that separation that I'm going to be gentle about asking about at his request, because he's under certain obligations not to disparage his former employers, but I'm sure these questions will come up over the course of the hour, and Austin is a very, very mature public leader and used to deciding what he wants to say and not say, so we don't have to be too gentle with him. But I think just to give you a sense of background that you might not otherwise be acquainted with, Austin was a really unusual person to take the leadership of a major American newspaper, because he did not grow up inside the publishing business or the newspaper business. He went to Dartmouth for undergraduate and went into finance, I think initially as an analyst, and then ultimately as a young partner at Blackstone, where he was in Russia during the transition from the Soviet Union and building that sort of economic upheaval from an investor's perspective. And then he founded his own investment bank and moved to Los Angeles as it grew. And then, it went public, and he decided to inaugurate another chapter in public life. And that ultimately led him to be the deputy mayor of Los Angeles in a kind of $1-a-year man's sort of role. And dipped his toe into electoral politics, and then was involved in an effort to acquire the Los Angeles Times. And when that didn't unfold, the owners of the Los Angeles Times asked him to come be the publisher. That's the short version of a complicated history. And so I met him a couple of years ago as he was starting out. He and some of his editors came to the school as part of a broad listening tour, just trying to think about how to change quickly and how to bring the Los Angeles Times mission, editorial mission of deep local reporting to a more sustainable economic footing. So let's just start with this basic proposition that you organized your tenure around, which is, you did believe that legacy papers like the LA Times could thrive in the digital age, but that they had to change really quickly. And I heard you say that right from the start, and I heard you say it just as you were going out the door too. So, but in what ways did you learn that local newspapers could thrive economically in a digital system, and what kind of change is necessary, do you believe?
Yeah, so let me start with that second part about the change and come back to how it can work or might work. Avram Miller from Intel Capital has a slogan he uses often to say, our plan for tomorrow can't be just hoping today lasts longer. And if you think about the narrative or the story most legacy media organizations talk about, it's perpetuating today. Can't we just make it last a little longer? Well, that's not going to get you there. So the change that we tried to work towards was fairly radical change if you look at it from the perspective of where are you today. But that doesn't mean you don't bring some great attributes as a legacy organization to be successful. Think of Los Angeles Times, and I'll talk more about Los Angeles than either San Diego or other parts of the country, but I think the archetype holds. It's the place where the story begins. It's an engaged audience. Almost 90% of those who subscribe to Los Angeles Times voted in 2012. The front page is looked at by almost 4 million people on any given Sunday. So it's where the story begins. There's lots of repeaters, but the story begins there. And the story is not just about the physical place of Los Angeles, but it's the stories of Los Angeles and how they connect to the rest of the world, or the rest of the world connects to us. So in a country where I think California is America's future, it's where you want to come, you see what America's going to look like, 25 years, come to California. There has to be some place where that story is told authentically by locals, by people who live that story, not a once-a-year visit from ProPublica, not a once-a-month visit from the New York Times, but each and every day who understand the context and place, and I think it can be successful. Now, the individual things we tried to do were, first and foremost, start by engaging the community.
Engaging the community in what way?
In every way possible. From simple things, a little publisher's book club, just get your engaged audience together talking about some of the narratives of Los Angeles, books and stories that fit the Los Angeles ideal. Engage high school students. We launched something called HS Insider because we saw this space where we couldn't cover the high school experience starting with sports, the easiest way in. How do we bring that next generation in? So we launched something called HS Insider, signing up high school students as journalists on an LA Times platform. Today there are more than 100 schools with 150,000 students in the HS Insider platform, engaging, telling stories, and not just about sports, but about the march that a school made to the state and national decathlon championship, or academic decathlon championship. So engage your audience, be public, be visible, and you will then have a better connection about the stories you're telling, and to find ways in the journalism itself to reconnect. You know, I was telling you a moment ago when we were together, an outgrowth of a conversation we had amongst the senior leadership team on the editorial side was, how do we find a way to engage more Angelenos in the body politic? So for the first time, Los Angeles Times launched an effort to grade local government. So we actually issued a report card on the mayor. And as the proud father of 1 child in college and 3 teenagers, look at a report card, it's not the alphanumeric that's most important, it's all the commentary. So our opinion team put together some really interesting commentary, trying to distinguish what's signal and what's noise, the signal we should all focus on about what's happening. And we had something on the order of 3/4 to maybe 100% of those who actually voted look at this. Meaning we could measure from the digital data about 200,000 people read it. You spend 5 minutes reading something, you share it with someone. So that audience in total who read it or discussed it was 300,000 or 400,000 people. In Los Angeles, in the last mayor's race, only 400,000 people voted. So if we can engage the community through those types of things, that's where you start, engage the community.
And how does, and this is a really important theme in the legacy media as it tries to make this transition these days, engagement, trying to measure engagement, trying to reward engagement rather than just monthly uniques that might be very shallow. So this sense that there could be a digital version that replicates the position that newspapers used to occupy in their communities, perhaps not as fully, but adequately to be sustainable. But even if you build an engagement strategy in digital spaces of that sort, not to be too crude about it, but how does that translate to revenue?
Yeah, it's a good question. It's the right question. And again, let's distinguish the random disengaged click. Okay, today, cyberspace, I don't know, 50 cents a thousand, something like that? Worthless, essentially worthless. You're not going to generate the tonnage or the scale to get paid to cover the cost of your journalism. So one of the first things we did was to look at email newsletters, an engaged audience. Anybody who lets you in your inbox every morning is an engaged consumer. So create a newsletter called Essential California, meant to be the daily pulse of what's happening in California. 8 or 10 stories, short summaries of those stories. It has an editor's voice, so there's voice there. Maybe half or 2/3 of those stories in any given day are in the first-person voice of Los Angeles Times. The rest would be curated from other news sources. We found an audience of more than 100,000 people in about 6 months at a $30 CPM. Not 50-cent CPM, a $30 CPM. So find that engaged audience and you'll find a whole new group of sponsors, in this particular instance, public affairs firms, people who want the most engaged Angelenos, Californians, and they'll pay handsomely to do it. You can do the math in your head. That's a multi-million-dollar piece of business. And we launched almost 20 of those. Not just the Pulse of California, but California politics, the Dodgers, food and dining in Los Angeles, water. We took water even further. We said water is not just a Los Angeles issue. It's not just a California issue. Really, west of the Continental Divide, we're all in the same water basin. So we started to think of different ways where that digital community of interest we might harvest and we might have a conversation with. So we wound up having a live interview, conversation with Governor Brown, an hour conversation like this, in front of a live audience, several hundred of our most dedicated subscribers. We partnered with public TV up and down the state. Lo and behold, almost more than a million households tuned in. The under-over when the governor and I were talking before the event was 20,000. How many people are going to watch something on public TV about water? 20,000 people. Almost a million households. That's more than watch 60 Minutes in California. Now, that's a business. That first event was sponsored. An Israeli agriculture firm happens to sell more than half the sprinkler irrigation systems in California, sponsored it. So we'd be sitting here with the sponsorship represented. Sponsorship on the TV segments, and a public TV no different than other sponsors would appear. So they found a place to carry their message. We found a place to create and speak first to that digital audience. So this wasn't a newspaper interview with Governor Brown. This was in a setting where we had an engaged conversation. We can then redact that, use the video as we chose, so we live streamed it. It was then repackaged and shown on public TV in many different ways. We had the audio of it, and then we had in the newspaper several follow-ons. Each of those, whether it's a newsletter, whether it's a live event and TV, if you think at its heart, it's built on journalism. That's where the legacy organization has its advantage. It's not distribution. Distribution in print, ubiquitous. If Macy's wants to reach your household, it's probably the best way in. Digital journalism, remember, digital, okay, but journalism. If you don't have the reputation and the quality of journalism, I don't think, absent the LA Times imprimatur, people would be so interested in that conversation, but the LA Times makes it work.
Well, and you I think, acquired a reputation, earned a reputation for being committed to journalism as part of at the heart of your strategy, and just the ways you're articulating. And certainly I know from talking to people in the newsroom that there was a sense of excitement about the partnership, not always easy because you're talking about change, and there were certainly, I'm sure, disagreements, but by and large the newsroom was excited about this direction, possibility of getting someplace that would lead and show how a newspaper, legacy newspaper, could create this transition. But you've also emphasized that the speed of change is a challenge for any legacy publishing organization that's been trying to extend the way things are for a long time. So what's your honest assessment of how modern legacy newsrooms are and are not prepared to go fast enough or far enough, in your opinion, to get where it's necessary to go? What are the biggest obstacles and what are the biggest advantages?
It's interesting. So much of the commentary is the newsroom and how fast can the newsroom go. I didn't find that to be the gating constraint. Sure, there's challenges because people are doing different things, and journalists want to make sure we're protecting the integrity of their work. That's fair. Okay, those boundaries one has to live with, and I subscribe to those. I found the greater challenge on the business side. People who
on the sales side, or
just
the
the business side, just the whole
yeah.
strategy side as a whole, the strategy of a company or a particular part of a company, and those, whether they're selling subscriptions, they're used to living in their silo. We had still do, the LA Times has something called the Los Angeles Times Festival of Books. It's the largest gathering of people around books and ideas in this country. And I can say that in New York, it happens in Los Angeles. Come visit. More than 150,000 people join us on the USC campus once a year. It's fantastic. And the demographics of the audience are unbelievable. These are people who are engaged in books and ideas. That existed in a separate silo from those who sold subscriptions. That existed in a separate silo from those who thought about events as a for-profit or revenue-generating exercise. So we changed two things. We said, you know what? Let's find a way to wall off this wonderful garden because some of the people will become subscribers. Let's at least ask them. How about if we gather their data? How about just the price of admission is give us your email or a phone number? We have, the course of that weekend, many, many dozens of events. Why don't we have one of them as a ticketed event? Still got 3 dozen free events, but maybe one is ticketed. The ticketed event was sold out in 12 minutes, and we sold 1,000 subscriptions. So that's got nothing to do with the newsroom. The newsroom, we're still moderating the panels, bringing in the books and ideas, reviewing the books, giving out the prizes. The change there was all on the business side, and this is an event that's been going on. This is the 20th year. It's the first time someone had thought to say, hey, maybe we should have a ticketed event in companionship with this. It works.
And so what was the length of time that you were in this leadership position?
A bit more than a year.
A bit more than a year. And I remember at the beginning you were kind of absorbing information, studying, trying to make a quick study of things. While you were going down this path, you had the New York Times iterating its strategy under new leadership. You had the Washington Post under new ownership and driving for a kind of national and global digital strategy that's still underway. How would you describe the difference between what you came to think was right and necessary for the Los Angeles Times and what you perceived those big legacy franchises to be doing?
Sure. It's not one size fits all. So think of the digital subscription effort of the New York Times. It's a unicorn. There's one place in space for a national skimming of the cream elite audience to subscribe to the New York Times. Congratulations. So that required some forethought and a strategy developed 10 years ago. It's working for them. Financial Times, Wall Street Journal, a different manifestation of that unicorn. They're trade publications. Hard to be in business today and not have some connectivity with the Wall Street Journal. That same opportunity doesn't exist for the Los Angeles Times. So Los Angeles Times 10 years from now is not going to have 1 million digital subscribers. So you have to look at what they're doing well and say, does it fit us or doesn't fit us? There are other things you look at the Wall Street Journal and say, they're doing really interesting work in this native advertising, sponsored content, whatever you want to call the advertorial of today. Look at the $30 CPM and that newsletter. It's sponsored content that's paying the $30 CPM. So we can learn from the New York Times or Wall Street Journal and say, this is what best-in-class execution looks like. Let's copy that. Let's see if it fits for us. So the one-size-fits-all, if you look, the models where I think real good experimentation is being done, New York Times, Wall Street Journal, Minneapolis, Boston, Washington, where you have ownership and leadership recognizing that it is not cost-cutting alone which is going to get you to the promised land. It just won't work. The math won't support it. I happen to think that the investments in journalism and the investments in a digital future will pay off, but they won't necessarily pay off in a year from now or 2 years from now. You have to have a longer view, and I think ownership and leadership in all those institutions have that longer view.
Well, this is a parochial question, but from a journalist perspective, one of the notable contexts at Tribune Company was bankruptcy, very dramatic downsizing, sometimes very deliberately taking out experienced editorial positions and replacing them with entry-level positions, sometimes around a skill change narrative, other times just for cost reasons or both. So as a business strategist, as you got to know the LA Times, how did you evaluate the kind of shrinkage in the newsroom as a factor in your challenges? What did you think about the value of veteran talent versus the energy of fresh talent?
That's your core asset, okay? The journalism and the connectivity, the experience, the relationships, that's what is value in the journalism. Think of a cub reporter in City Hall versus someone who's been there for 20 years. person there for 20 years understands the place, the context, the history of not only individuals, but what's being discussed, versus the cub who shows up, looks at the press release and says, Janine, will you answer a few questions for me? You need that experience. That's value. So financially, yes, it appears in the short term you're replacing a $200,000 a year reporter with someone who makes $100,000 a year. Long term, you're losing your most valuable asset. It's not a winning strategy. It doesn't make sense. If you try to cloud that with the narrative of, well, we need more digital savvy journalists. Let's parse through the digital savvy from journalism and recognize the two skills. One's a learned craft, one's sort of technical set of tools. I happen to be involved with an institution called CalArts, California Institute of the Arts, where we teach animation, high-level animation. And every couple, 3 years, there's a debate at the board level as to whether or not we need to invest more in the tools. So it's 3D animation now, and it'll be 4D 2 years from now versus the hand-drawn. And the board and the leadership of the institute will go to the graduates at Pixar and Disney and all the great animators and say, what do you think? And they'll say, what I learned at CalArts is how to tell a story. I learned how to tell a story hand-drawn, in 3D, or whatever's to come, and the same would be true for journalism today. So taking out your most experienced, your best trained workforce and replacing them with less trained people, that's not what you want to do from journalism. Now, you may have to retrain people. So maybe that typing class is not so important anymore, and maybe it's a class on HTML5 or something else, so they'll understand the interface, how their journalism gets translated to a podcast, to a video of some sort, or actually to a good old-fashioned column. But that and the day-to-day conduct of journalism and how to source and how to separate fact from fiction has got nothing to do with the platform on which it's presented.
And so if you had 3 or 4 more years, as you were visualizing where you were going, and obviously you had a big acquisition of the San Diego paper, the Orange County paper went through a crisis and might have been part of a whole Southern California complex eventually if you'd been able to acquire it. But I was trying to, I understand, and you've been very inspiring in talking about where engagement leads in terms of the demography of your audience and the potential to build revenue and subscriptions around that. But what was the end state that you could see 3 or 4 years out in terms of where circulation revenue would fit, where advertising revenue would fit, given that the broader ecosystem of digital advertising is still at the 50-cent CPM, and given that, as you say, the New York Times' digital subscription opportunity is a unicorn. So what would the revenue mix, you hope, look like in 3 or 4 or 5 years if you could have aggregated all of Southern California, driven it to a digital shore, and then started to build something more stable and virtuously growing from that stage?
Yeah, I mean, it's a good question. And my crystal ball is no better than anyone else's, but look at the pieces we were trying to put in place. So the combination with San Diego gave us more runway. Good old-fashioned print economies of scale. So the San Diego Union-Tribune is now printed at the Olympic plant of Los Angeles Times. Savings to be reinvested in digital tools, to be reinvested in journalism, or to be transferred elsewhere. If you look at the scale now in the Olympic plant, there are more single daily copies out of that plant than any other newspaper plant in the country. It means the last print newspaper reader is most likely in the Southern California DMA somewhere, he or she. I don't know whether that's 5 years from now or 25 years from now, but extend that runway, find true scale in the print business. You're buying print from the same place, newsprint, ink, and printing in the same place. Now digitally, if you're building around these communities of interest, which I think is where a lot of digital journalism is going, it's not the website, come find it. Any given day on a newspaper website, 1%, 2%, 3% of what's there actually gets looked at. That's a pretty poor business. You need to disaggregate it, think of those communities of interest. And because the California narrative is so rich, the Southern California narrative is so rich, it's not just Los Angeles politics, it's California politics. It's not just the energy and the environment in Los Angeles, it's what does that mean for VW and diesel standards, and since it all came from CARB and what happened in California. It's not just TPP and the Washington story, but the biggest port complex in the country is in Southern California. So the digital or the vertical community of interest story is so big and broad, we thought that the ability to be revenue promiscuous, newsletters, sponsored events, TV, audio, all of those things had a nickel or a dime for us. Not the print dollar, but a nickel or dime, and you plant enough of those in the hopes that some grow, some become 5 or 10 years from now that dollar. I don't think anybody thought 10 years ago when New York Times started down the path toward digital subscriptions, we'd be sitting here today saying they have 1 million digital subscribers. The same might be true of the LA Times event business or the TV business that we embarked on with public TV and the conversation with Governor Brown on water. Got to try. The ones that don't work, try something else. The ones that work, give them a little gas, a little oxygen, and feed them.
So I'll ask one more question, and then y'all can prepare to join us. And we are, I should have said at the beginning, on the record. We're obviously videotaping, live streaming, and so be aware when the time comes to ask questions that your words are being recorded for posterity, and please identify yourself. I do want to ask one question about the Tribune Company and and your departure. I guess just as a reader, without asking you to comment about them, maybe just clarify some of the coverage that involved you. I suppose as a reader of the New York Times and other papers, and there wasn't a lot of sources on the record in the story, so with that caveat, it was a little bit hard to tell where things were coming from. I guess there were two sort of narratives that seemed to come out of Chicago. One was that the financial performance was weak, and that was why they wanted to act, and the other was that you were less cooperative as a subordinate than headquarters wanted, which wouldn't be shocking given the history of your career if it were true. But what is your take on those two narrative lines that I'm sure you must have read at your breakfast table in those days as well?
On the second, guilty as charged. When I took the job, I think, as I told you, I was very public in saying, if you're looking for a caretaker, you got the wrong guy. The strategy that we were embarking on had been vetted, reviewed by the board to unanimous acclaim, and that's what we were doing. As far as the financial performance, we were on plan. As far as I understand, the business continues to be on plan. We might have been investing in different things than corporate leadership wished us to invest in. But as I understood it, that was within the purview of the publisher. But if you look at what we said in January in our strategy and what we actually achieved, spot on.
Great. Okay, so let's open the questioning up to others. Yes, please identify yourself. There's a microphone also, so if you just wait for that, then everyone will be able to hear you.
Yeah, hello. My name is Devansh. I'm a student here at the J School. So I'll just give you some numbers from the New York Times, and I'd like to see how what your model is. So New York Times, basically their cost of running their newsroom is $1.1 billion. They get about $144 million through their subscriptions, and the majority, over 70%, is still coming from print, which is majority print newspapers, right? So as print goes down and down, their digital subscriptions aren't going to keep up to match that $1.1 billion cost of their newsroom. So at the LA Times, do you think, what strategies do you have other than relying on old print advertisements and digital subscriptions, which are really cheap? I think about $1.99 for the first 4 weeks. So is that really enough to sustain the cost of the newsroom and have the kind of reach and coverage which you currently have?
Sure.
Is the newsroom really that expensive? Can I just point of order?
Yeah, point of order. I would check.
What is the cost of the New York Times newsroom? $300 million. Yeah.
All right, so we've reduced that cost pretty dramatically.
That was a very good first quarter you had there.
Yeah. So without commenting specifically on what the dollars invested in the Los Angeles Times newsroom versus New York Times, but the same issue presents itself in both, which is there is no silver bullet. So anyone who you can make a digital subscriber, of course. The real question is, where do you go beyond that? Do you have an event business? Have you figured out how to take your content into video, into podcast, into events, into other places and spaces where you can find sponsorship money, you can find subscribers, you can find engagement of some sort. And I think that's the challenge New York Times faces, that's the challenge Los Angeles Times or others face. I think we had certain advantages in that we are more place-based. We are a more identifiable community. If the New York Times has skimmed the cream digitally, kind of hard to convene, kind of hard to think of aspects of that business scaling in a national platform, much easier done in a local marketplace. So we had some advantages, and they have certain advantages, but it's not just a one-for-one conversion of a print subscriber to a digital subscriber. That's not going to get you there.
Yes.
Oh, hi, Lucia Hoffman. I am a part-time student here, and I'm sorry you just had a short time there. I think sometimes you need to have more faith, and but I don't think the New York Times has reached a sustainable business model yet. But they did raise the bar, and they have been very aggressive. And I think one of the most important changes was that they were able to kind of transfer the same quality they had in print, to digital. So my question to you is that, does it put more pressure in the media, in other media organizations to do the same when I agree with you, there is, it's not one size fits all. You can't just copy what the New York Times, is doing. It might not work, for some other organizations.
So to reframe the question slightly, it's with absent one size fits all. How are the journalistic values going to translate to digital? Is that a fair?
No, meaning that because the New York Times is doing well, 1 million subscription. They have this plan in 5 years to get to 2 million. But it's not. They're still relying on print. For
So
for
where does
revenues.
print fit?
No, but it's not one print field. But is it safe for for us to follow the same business model as the New York Times is
No.
following? That's my question.
It's not one size fits all. It's look at any strategy. Forget just looking at newspapers or legacy media organizations. That strategy has to fit where you are. One of the challenges, I think, the legacy media organization as a whole, and this is beyond the Tribune, this is beyond Gannett, this is even looking at some of the TV organizations. Their original design and purpose was a few wealthy families combining their assets and taking them public as a way to exit. So now here we are a generation or two later trying to perpetuate that. Well, if it's at its foundation, you have pieces that don't fit together for any strategic purpose other than, hey, we can get out this way. Why are we perpetuating that? And so I think that each organization has to look and say, how's it best placed to win the fight or continue to provide great journalism? I grew up in a small town in the Midwest, Grand Rapids, Michigan. I don't know what the digital strategy is for Grand Rapids. Their best strategy may be as part of, I think they're part of the Gannett. I think the paper's owned one of the Gannett fold of 100 papers that cover a third of the country. That may be good enough or the best that's possible, because I don't know, there are so many stories in Grand Rapids that the digital version of them will connect to anywhere else other than Grand Rapids. That's not true in Los Angeles. Los Angeles and California, 38 million people, where America sees its future, the most diverse big city in this country, the window to Asia and Latin America. That's a pretty powerful organizing principle for lots and lots of different stories. So I think on its own it can survive and prosper, but not one size fits all. Grand Rapids Press, you need a different answer. I'm not sure what that one is.
Robbie, you're also permitted to ask questions. I just want to make that clear. Wait for the mic.
Hi, my name is Zara Lakshan. I'm an MS student here. I just moved here from Los Angeles, and I intend to return there after graduation. My understanding is that the LA Times generates a lot of revenue for the Tribune company, and they're not eager to release their hold on the Times. And I was wondering if you had considered starting a local paper in LA with Eli Broad.
I don't know about whether Tribune's willing to relinquish their hold, so I'll let them comment on that. Starting a new journalism enterprise is not for the weak of heart. I mean, frankly, buying a newspaper is not for the weak of heart, nor is being publisher of a newspaper. I started down this path because I believe The Los Angeles Times is a civic conscience. If it doesn't ask the hard questions of the body politic in Los Angeles and California, nobody will. And if it doesn't celebrate what's good and unique in our community, there are very few organizations that will. So it's necessary. The art of the possible, we're talking a little bit about. None of us here know today exactly what's possible, but I think it's worth trying. And one of the things that's worth trying is some digital manifestation of it. I happen to think there are quite a number of advantages coming off a legacy platform if you combine the entrepreneurial zeal of, okay, we're a startup. Let's just focus on what we can do differently, where we would start. So if we wanted to start an event business, how to start an event business? Well, let's see, if I lived in Los Angeles or California, I'd want to pick a big meaty topic. Okay, water. I want to see if I can get the governor. Okay, we got the governor. Let's see if we can get TV distribution for it. Great. Now, it just so happens we can port that into this wonderful Los Angeles Times platform and find other ways to get paid and other ways to distribute that. But if any of us were going to start a digital organization, some of the things we were doing are exactly where a digital organization would start. You know, the daily newsletter, Essential California, I'd like to think we came up with those. We didn't. The first one I started subscribing to was Mike Allen's Daily Playbook from Politico. For me, it replaced the Washington Post. I used to get the Sunday Washington Post in print in Los Angeles. Didn't get the daily. I got the weekly, kind of catch up, read what's going on. I got Mike Allen every morning in my inbox. I don't need the Washington Post. So I think there's an opportunity digitally, but I think that opportunity is still better tied to a legacy platform if possible.
Ravi and then Bill.
So my question's actually for both of you.
You can maybe just let everyone know who you are.
My name's Ravi. I'm a reporter with the New York Times. My question's for both of you, and it is, do you think transformation of any legacy media property is possible as a public company?
What's the last part?
As a public company, can you transform these businesses as public companies? And it's for both of you.
What do you think?
You know, I think it's possible. Okay, I don't think it's a fool's errand, because I think you start from a position of advantage, I was just suggesting. But the other missing piece is you have to have a pretty transparent dialogue with your shareholders and make sure you set expectations properly. If your shareholder base is expecting to harvest cash, and their perspective on an investment in your legacy business is, what's my dividend next quarter? And are you cutting enough costs to pay my dividend? That's a disconnect with the strategy I've been articulating. I happen to think there are shareholders who might invest in a longer term view. BuzzFeed has no difficulty attracting capital. Vox, Vice, many very successful entrepreneurial digital organizations are attracting capital. And I happen to think there is capital who might come to a legacy organization, but they'd have to buy into that strategy. And right now what you have are mostly the publicly held groups saying, we will harvest cash and give it to you as quickly as we can. That's at odds with trying to make sure you have a not only successful but prosperous business 3, 4, 5 years down the road. And you'd have to connect those two, and I think you could find a shareholder base to support that.
Yeah, I don't have a lot to add, except I guess from what little I know and can see as I gotten involved on the board of Gannett just this summer and still trying to figure out what's possible. A lot depends on what kind of an operator you are, because you need runway in order to make the investments that will get you to the far shore. And you know, if you're a great operator and you've got a big whole that's larger than the sum of its parts, then that's an enormous advantage over being a relatively medium-sized, chopped up and debt-laden company, which is, I'm afraid, the position of a bunch of other legacy groups. And you know, if you look at a place like Hearst, which is not publicly held and also a very good operator on the nuts and bolts side, but they've benefited from having the space to make these big strategic investments outside of their core. So, you know, they ended up with a piece of ESPN and BuzzFeed and other things that have enriched them. Now, could they have made those bets if they were publicly traded? I think that's a question, but I think mostly they were able to do it because they had free cash flow from being great operators in their core, and then a vision that said we need to move fast in other directions and think of ourselves as a kind of partly a VC company. And Now, how you have the talent to do all those things at the same time in the executive ranks, that's a challenge for sure. But I don't know. I think when you look at the companies that are in this space right now, a place like McClatchy with their balance sheet, I mean, that they just have no running room.
No, they're not. I mean, they're out of the cancer ward. They're in hospice.
Yeah.
And they may not see themselves that way, but they are. And, so back to the point, Robbie, think of sort of, you got this 5-foot ditch with alligators in the middle. You commit yourself to one side or the other. So stay over here, harvest. That feels safe, maybe, because it's predictable. It's what you did yesterday. In the words of Avram Miller, let's just hope tomorrow looks a lot like today. All right? And don't confront the alligators. Now, maybe that side you're going to fall in there anyways, but it feels safe. Or try to get across. But if you try to get across, you better have some conviction. You better have a little wind at your back and a little bit of luck, because you don't want to wind up in the middle. And I think the difference in the organization I was part of is you got to walk that walk if you're going to talk it. So if you're trying to get across with conviction, otherwise stay in that safe zone, cut costs, and that'll take you as far as it might. Never going to get you across.
Bill.
Hi, I'm Bill Gruskin. I teach here. I also was at WSJ.com for a long time, and out of full disclosure, I gave an opinion from Henry Waxman on the Tribune bankruptcy, so I got that out there. Is part of the problem that the whole idea of a large metro newspaper is irretrievably broken, that the oligopoly over information that it used to have no longer exists, and that it's both too small and too big? It can never compete with a New York Times or a BBC. At the same time, it can't compete with a small weekly or biweekly newspaper that, especially in a community like LA that has so many atomized communities, doesn't really need the kind of information that a large metro newspaper is going to provide. And, is it best just to try to break it up and have 20 little newspapers covering LA rather than one big one?
Can a large metro survive? I would take, maybe it is the contrarian view, but I'd take the view that yes, it can, if it recognizes where it has unique value to add to the conversation and where it doesn't. And that's important. So to date, the metro strategy, for the most part, has been, we have less peanut butter, let's just keep spreading it around. So we're going to cut in the newsroom, and we no longer have X, we have half X or a third X, but we're still going to cover all those beats. That doesn't work so well. Then you're not much to anybody. But if you think of where LA, because that conversation is so rich and deep, and there are so many communities of interest that tie, both small physical ones as well as broader thematic ones. Think of the story that Julie Mackinnon wrote on air quality in Beijing. Okay, there's no shortage of reporters writing about air quality in Beijing. There's only one person who was capable and had the mandate to bring it back to the place where in this country we've dealt with air quality for a generation, Los Angeles and Los Angeles Basin. So her story to me was richer and traveled better than any story written on that topic. The ports, as I mentioned earlier. Think of same-sex marriage, Prop 8. That's a California theme and idea. Immigration reform, I don't know that the LA Times has covered as well as we could and should have. So I think for a metropolitan area as diverse and interesting as Los Angeles, I think it's possible. But you have to believe that those communities of interest find an audience beyond just the DMA of Los Angeles for it to work economically.
So there's a business version of Bill's question, and then there's a kind of identity editorial version of it. So what do people identify with, and so therefore what might you be able to serve them? Was it your belief that ultimately San Diego, Orange County, Los Angeles were enough of a single place that you could have, in a sense, unified them around a single strategy?
No, but let's look at components now, because the San Diego, Los Angeles, and Orange County wasn't part of it, so I'll stay away from that one. When we had the conversation with Jerry Brown, we sat in front of a backdrop like this that said Los Angeles Times, San Diego Union-Tribune. It was live streamed on both websites. Some of the questions I asked were on behalf of Los Angeles Times readers, and some were on behalf of San Diego Union-Tribune readers. The drought in California is the drought in California. Kind of same lack of water in San Diego there is in Los Angeles. Coverage. 2 teams went to the Belmont, San Diego and Los Angeles. Now there was not a pony from Los Angeles or San Diego, so I'm not sure we needed 4 people, maybe 2. So there's some economies and there's some stories that transcend that individual brand or title or local community. There's some that are very local. The report cards that we did in Los Angeles wouldn't travel to San Diego. Trust me, they don't travel so well back and forth. But that doesn't mean we couldn't do report cards on San Diego electeds in San Diego. So to be valid in that broad and big a melting pot, you'd have to make sure you're bringing to that customer what's unique to their local identity. And at the same time, a lot is actually common. So we were trying to straddle that balance, and I think it makes the dollar go further in the newsroom, and it makes it more interesting from an ad sales standpoint or anything else, because now you're offering, Southern California, if you're trying to sell a Mercedes in this country, 40% of S-Class Mercedes are sold in Southern California.
It's not shocking somehow.
And 80% of Teslas, so we cover both sides.
Hi, Joe Pompeo with Politico. In terms of the cuts that are planned at Tribune Publishing and are expected to impact the LA Times, what do you think that could do for the value of the paper for anyone who may or may not be interested in trying to make a bid for it?
So the cuts at the Tribune, first of all, I don't work there anymore, so I'm not informed as to what level they will be or how many people or the nature of the people who will be cut. But as I said earlier in response to Steve's question, I think the core asset of the LA Times is the value and experience of its journalists. Experienced journalists. Not body count, not number of beats covered, but how much human capacity do we have on a particular topic, whether it's Julie in Beijing or Steve Lopez and his really timeless columns on life in Los Angeles. You lose that, you've lost value. You may short-term financially feel you've replaced an individual with someone where their wage, he or she, is lesser in that moment in time, but long-term, you're cutting the value. No different than a drug company. You could tomorrow get rid of all the research scientists and your profit that quarter will be better, but long-term, you're not going to have many drugs in the pipeline. And it's the same with any journalism organization. Your experienced journalists are more valuable.
So there's another version of Ravi's question, I suppose, or maybe a first cousin of it, which goes back to something you said earlier when you said that the trouble with the change agenda, as you experienced, wasn't so much in the newsroom as it was on the business side. And certainly those of us who've worked at legacy newspapers in a certain era, not to denigrate the relationship building that's required to build a successful sales organization, but in a lot of those places, the main thing was just to answer the phone, because the market position was so dominant that people required the newspaper, and the sales organization grew up in that kind of a position. And then on the technology side, the distribution system was so static for so long that the technology investments and connecting technology to strategy just wasn't necessary, really, other than to make the front end of the content management work. So I would imagine you have a few arrow holes in your back from walking onto the business side of the room and saying, this is just not even close. We got to move a lot faster, and we're going to need a whole different set of outlooks and skills to get there. And so if you were advising someone else coming in to a similar position in a legacy organization on the business and technology side, both in terms of the practical pace and strategy for change, but also the kind of visioning, what do you feel like you've learned about how to do that if you were to go back to the starting line?
Let's put aside the learnings about life in a publicly traded company and focus more on a particular part of that. Probably change faster. And that sounds hard to say in a legacy organization, but get up in the morning and compete with yourself. If it took us 6 months to get a newsletter launched, that's too long. If it took us X or Y or Z to put together a partnership with KCET and turn that into a television business of some sort. That's too long. You've got to operate more like a startup, and the precious capital you have is not the financial investment, it's time. Take a particular vertical, California politics. Politico's launched, LA Times is launched, New York Times may or may not be too far behind. Someone will stake a claim on that. Certainly Los Angeles Times, as a legacy organization, would be one of the few that have the heritage. So what? That gets you to the starting line. Where are you going to be in 6 months from now, a year from now? So I'd say the single greatest learning is move faster if we could.
Great. Well, thank you, Austin, for doing this. We're really very grateful. And please join me in thanking him for giving us this time.
Thank you. It's my pleasure.
All right, thanks for coming.